which is an attempt to try and make a series of suggestions regarding what I believe to be the key ingredients in securing that good or better judgment and achieving good or better learning within our classrooms. So I'm going to go through a series of features that may act as a prompt or a reminder, or even as a reflective checklist to support planning and further improvement in our classroom practice. So I'm going to start the tutorial really with an obvious statement, but one which is well worth considering, and it's the fact that the learning objective or learning objectives should target and challenge students with regards to higher order thinking. At least one of those targets should be taken from Bloom's taxonomy's higher order thinking of either evaluate or create or synthesize. Obviously you wouldn't use the word synthesize in your objective, but design, to assess, to measure. It really should target some of those higher order thinking skills, and then the lesson can be deemed to be cognitively challenging regardless of the ability range of the students. You're making them think. You're making their heads hurt, as I've said in some previous CPD sessions, or what I've also said in previous CPD sessions is making the students say, really challenge that thinking. Now, this little aside consideration really is that obviously if you prefer to have a series of objectives, I mean, really, I would recommend that you don't go beyond 3, if you know, and even going up to 3 only if you must. But really, if you at least one of the objectives should target higher order thinking. You may have middle or lower order thinking objective that precedes it and therefore builds students up to accessing that higher order thinking, so that their thought process follows a gradually more difficult and logical order. Now that may come out of your learning objectives, but at least one should target higher order thinking using those command terms. Now, once you've done that, really, the next step, really, if you like, in the lesson process, is getting that settler task planned. Now, ideally, it should relate to the topic or the content of the lesson that's about to come, but really it is just a settler. And there wouldn't be, from an observer's point of view, we wouldn't give much consideration to the level of challenge of this settler. It is just that, really. So, objective set, settler in place. Now is the key part of really beginning to make this lesson good or better and establish good or better learning. So I'm going to use some type of performance data to establish my 3 ability groupings within the class. Now, it is worth saying at this point that obviously if there is only 2 levels of ability within your group, then only plan for 2 ability groups. But this thinking around the 3 ability ranges is really given it's based on a preconception that you will have a more able group of students, a least able group of students, and then some students in between those 2 extremes, really. So that's really the vague premise on which we encourage you to work on 3 ability ranges. But as I say, if there aren't those different ability groups within it, just plan for those that are. Adapt the learning plan so that it suits the group in front of you. Don't manipulate the group so it fits the learning plan. But essentially, you're being asked here to base your ability groupings on some sort of performance data. Now, that might be Key Stage 2 data. That might be their last test that they've sat. It might just be on the observation from the previous lesson, but there should be some performance data to support why you've got students working in the ability groupings that they have. Okay, and really your thought is what it says there, deciding what they will need to be able to do to demonstrate good progress. And you might share this in the form of success criteria, but obviously you wouldn't be sharing all 3 separate sets of criteria. Students and groups of students would simply be working to personalised criteria that you've shared with them individually or within groups. Now, in terms of this phrase of good progress, it is worth just clarifying what that means. For Key Stage 3 students, for a student to be deemed to be making good progress, they should be working at least a level above their current. So if all your performance data says that that student's a level 3 or a 3A, then ideally this lesson that you planned should be allowing students to access level 4. Similarly at Key Stage 4, again, the lesson should be developmental enough and supportive enough and structured enough to allow students that, let's say, have previously been working at a C grade to be accessing B grade criteria. That's not to say they're going to achieve a B grade in that lesson. Obviously, in most cases that wouldn't be possible, but they should be accessing elements of the B grade criteria. So that's what we would deem good progress. Anything less than that would simply be deemed natural or satisfactory, or even, you know, the kind of progress they would make normally without your skill and input. Okay, now we're getting to, I think, really the crux of ensuring that good learning is taking place, and it's the designing and the development of a mini plenary, or a task that checks student progress. Now, I think that, you know, I've got this quite early in the planning process. I do think it is that important that it should be, if you like, the next thing to be thought about. Now, this mini plenary should really cut to the fundamental learning points that you're hoping students will be able to understand and access in order to meet that higher order learning objective. So that might be a series of 3 really deep, well planned and well thought out questions that you would ask systematically each group at a time. It might be a small card sort task that again really gets to the core and assesses those fundamental learning points. It might even be a short 4 or 5 mark exam question that you just distribute on slips and students quickly attempt. But it needs to be quite short, it needs to be punchy, and wherever possible you should be able to repeat the task through the lesson. And so it needs to be brief enough to be able to do that within the lesson structure, so that progress really can be checked. Because really, once you've got those 3 ability groups and you've got your mini plenary planned, that I would say is now the structure for good or better learning, because essentially what you're now going to have is these different ability groups working on a task or sequence of tasks that will enable them to demonstrate the kind of things that you've set out in the success criteria above. So obviously once these students are well underway in these tasks, you would, and obviously these are supported by differentiated resources, where actually the individualised criteria should be displayed really on those resources, so that students can keep checking back to their particular criteria and ensure that they're meeting them. But once these tasks are underway, this mini plenary is then performed almost on a carousel type system, where you move from ability group to ability group and perform this mini plenary. Now, as I say, if this is short enough, it can be performed on the same group more than once through the course of the lesson, and therefore progress can be demonstrated. Okay. What is crucial with a mini plenary task is the task, obviously the mini plenary task itself, as we've already established, but also the other activity that students are engaging in. It needs to be big enough and well structured enough to allow you the time to perform the mini plenary in the different groups. So you can't keep having to stop the mini plenary or process or the assessment process in order to move the students along to the next task. The task should be big enough and meaty enough to allow you 20 or 30 minutes really to get around each group. So that is something that isn't always thought about, but is crucial in order to be able to perform a meaningful mini plenary. Okay. When it comes to questioning, questioning sessions really need to be planned carefully. I would strongly recommend against now long-winded whole class Q&A sessions. On the whole, these tend not to be planned well, and you can tell when they're not planned well when rather sometimes random questions start to appear in a long list of quite closed and short questions. You can also tell it's poorly planned when the member of staff or the teacher is actually talking more than the students. So there'll be a long question and it'll only prompt a single word answer from students, which is then elaborated on by the member of staff for 2 to 3 minutes. Think about questions that you really need to ask in order to assess whether learning has taken place and whether students have understood the key concepts of the lesson. Because essentially, if a question session does not assess understanding or deepen it, it shouldn't be in the lesson. The other thing with questioning sessions, endeavour, as I say, to go around small groups as opposed to actually, standing at the front and asking all students to take part in a questioning session. Okay. These mini plenaries, another idea for a potential mini plenary is simply to ask students to reflect on the success criteria that you've shared with them at some point previously in the lesson. Again, prompting students to go back to criteria whilst the lesson is taking place massively increases their likelihood to actually demonstrate that criteria, rather than simply sharing it with them at the beginning of the task and then marking them against it or assessing them against it at the end of the task. If in your lesson structure you allow students opportunities to reflect on those criteria and then relatively immediate opportunities to act on it, student outcomes will be much stronger as a result. And finally, something else that really does kind of mark, or the hallmarks of good or better learning, is when during these tasks students can articulate these 3 things: what they're learning, what progress they've made, and what they need to do to improve further. Okay, so use this, if you like, as a checklist. If you recognise in your lesson structures and you recognise in your lessons all of these features, I would say that you have a very strong chance of securing good or better learning. If there are 1 or 2 features of this that you don't quite recognise, inject them. Plan for these things to actually take place in the lesson, because if there are 3 or 4 of these features that don't appear in your lesson structure, frequently appear in your lesson structure, then it would be unlikely for good or better learning to be taking place. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed it. Use it as much or as little as you see fit, and hope you've enjoyed it and taken something from it.